A great way to support our salty gameplay is by building your next deck using our TCG Player affiliate link provided in the description below. Now let's get into the game. Today we have Sterling playing Kiki-Jiki, Mirror Breaker. Sean's playing Feather, the Redeem. Keith's coming in with Slimefoot, the Stowaway. And Dom's taking it home with Talrand, Sky Summoner. Recording.
I'm recording.
Recording!
I'm recording.
Ooh, shiny, wani, wani.
Alright, gentlemen. Shall we roll?
Roll.
Shiny, wani, wani, wani.
19.
17.
11.
12. This is one of my cards in my opening hand.
We're all ready to go.
Keith, this is one of mine.
You never give away.
I'm gonna
anything.
play
I always,
myself.
I don't care. I always give away something.
This is
good.
one of mine.
I'm playing myself Mountain.
Mount.
I'm gonna go ahead and tap
Fine,
for
Keith.
Skull Clamping in.
Ooh. I am about to light shit off with a forest. And I'll pass.
I'm going to draw. I'm going to also play Plains. And I'm going to also pass the turn. I'm done.
I'm gonna draw. Big time island play. Pass.
Untap.
Alright, ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the game. Sterling draws, drops a mountain, and then taps 2 for a ruby medallion. He then passes his turn. Keith draws, drops a swamp, and then shows off his green ramp by tapping 2 for a 3 visits. Sterling is jealous. He grabs a forest and puts that into play. He begins to tap it, thinking he has something he can do. And then he remembers he doesn't. Sadly, he passes his turn. Sean draws, drops the plains down, and then passes his turn.
Dom draws, drops an island, and then pays 2 to cast a Thought Vessel. He then passes his turn.
Sterling draws, plays a mountain, and then taps 1 for Soul Ring. He taps that Soul Ring and a mountain to play Flame Shadow Conjuring. This allows him to tap 1 whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield to make a copy with haste. He then passes his turn. Keith draws, plays a forest, and then taps 3 for Druidic Satchel. He then taps an additional forest to play a salad. I'm sorry, salad? Is that just Mike Tyson saying salad? He then patheth his turn. Sean draws, taps 2 for a Talisman of Conviction. He then bounces one of the tapped plains to his hand and plays a Boros Garrison. He passes his turn. Dom draws, plays an island, and then taps 3 to play Diamond Knight.
Diamond Knight!
This is diamond.
I think Diamond Knight's from Yu-Gi-Oh!
He then taps 1 to play Serum Visions, drawing a card and scrying 2. He then passes his turn. Sterling draws. He then taps 1 to play a Dockside Extortionist, creating 4 treasures for each artifact and enchantment his opponents control. He then pays 1 into Flame Shadow Conjuring, creating a token copy of his Dockside, generating 4 more treasures. Fuck. Sterling then uses 2 of the treasures to enchant his Dockside with Splinter Twin. This allows him to tap Dockside to create a token copy with haste. Sterling then taps his Soul Ring to play Mycosynth Wellspring, allowing him to search his library for any basic land card. Unsurprisingly, he grabs a mountain. Sterling then taps 1 and sacrifices 2 treasures to play Beetleback Chief. Once again, he pays 1 into the Flame Shadow Conjuring to create a token copy of Beetleback Chief. This generates 4 Goblin tokens. He then sacrifices his final 3 treasures to equip Skull Clamp to 3 of his newly created Goblin tokens, killing them and drawing 6 cards. Shit. Sterling then goes to combat. He swings his 2/2 Beetleback Chief token at Dom. Dom doesn't block. This brings him down to 38. Sterling also swings his 1/1 token Dockside Extortionist at Keith. Keith doesn't block and goes down to 39. This places the crown upon Sterling's head, making him the Monarch. He then passes his turn, drawing for Monarch. Keith draws. Sterling begs for people not to target him, after specifically painting a target on himself. Keith evaluates his options to either continue with his deck's plans or to take care of Sterling's board. Keith fields some offers from Dom and Sean, accepting their terms of non-aggression, at least for a few turns. Keith then taps 3 to beast within Sterling's dockside, taking care of not only the dockside, but also its wooden twin. Sterling gets a 3/3 beast. He then taps 2 in his druidic satchel to look at the top card of his library. Finding a land, he puts it onto the battlefield. Keith then passes his turn. Sean draws. Keith vapes.
Alright, well that helps.
Sean then drops a plains and taps 4 for a smothering tithe. He then passes his turn. As he passes his turn, Sean is dragged slowly into the abyss, never to be seen again, leaving only his headphones behind.
What happened?
Did it feel like he died a little bit right there?
A little bit.
Okay, I got it.
It
We're
felt
good.
a little strokey.
Dom draws, plays an island. He then contemplates his next move, play something now, or live to prevent Sterling from playing anything fun.
That's not a treasure token. That's a treasure token.
He decides to wait, but maybe he wants to draw a little. He taps 1 to play Opt, scrying and then drawing a card. This gives the Diamond Knight a +1/+1 counter, and allows Sean to create an additional treasure. As Dom passes his turn, Sean taps his Talisman of Conviction for a plains, pinging himself for 1, bringing him down to 39. He then casts Tear, targeting the Flame Shadow Conjuring, destroying it. Dom's turn then officially ends. Sterling draws, and then taps 3 to play Mimic Vat. He then taps 3 to play Perforos, God of the Forge. Dom the Heretic taps 2 to counter the god. Sterling then taps 1 to play Goblin Recruiter, searching his library for any number of goblin cards and putting them on the top of his library. He searches for a Krenko mob boss and places that on top. He then passes his turn, drawing for Monarch. Keith untaps and draws. Once again, missing his land drop. In green? How embarrassing. He then taps 2 for Sapperling Migration, creating 2 Sapperling tokens. Keith then taps 2 and the Druidic Satchel to look at the top card of his library. It's a land, so he puts it into play. Keith then taps 2 for a Vitaspore Salad. Thallid. He then passes his turn. Sean draws, and then taps 3 to play Feather the Redeemed. But I have to admit it does look pretty good on his playmat. Sean then taps 1, the Talisman of Conviction, and sacks a treasure to play a Boros Cluestone. He then remembers he hasn't played a land yet, and drops the plains onto the battlefield. He taps said plains to play a Defiant Strike, targeting Feather. This gives Feather a +1/+0, and allows Sean to draw a card. Due to Feather's ability, the instant will go into exile, and at the end of his turn, it will return to his hand. Sean then passes his turn, receiving the Defiant Strike. Dom draws, and then taps 4 to play Talrand, Sky Summoner. He then taps 1 to play a Brainstorm, drawing 3, keeping 2, and putting 1 back on top of his library. He gets to add 2 +1/+1 counters to the Diamond Knight. This also creates a 2/2 Blue Drake, thanks to Talrand. He then drops a Mystic Sanctuary onto the battlefield, returning the counterspell from his graveyard to the top of his library.
After tapping the Mystic Sanctuary to cast a Soul Ring,
He then passes his turn, but at the end of his turn, Sean taps 1 to play Defiant Strike, targeting Feather. This gives Feather a +1/+0 and allows him to draw an extra card. Dom's turn then finally passes. Sterling untaps and draws. He plays a Mountain and then taps 3 to play Krenko, Mob Boss. He then taps 2 to play a Fire Diamond, tapped. Sterling then taps 1 to equip the Skull Clamp to Goblin Recruiter, killing it and drawing 2 cards. At the end of Sterling's turn, Sean sacrifices one of his treasures to play Defiant Strike, targeting Feather, once again drawing a card. Sterling then passes his turn, drawing for Monarch. Keith draws, plays a Golgari Guildgate tapped. He then taps 5 to play Doubling Season, to everyone's disgust. He then sacks the 3 Spore counters on his Salad, creating 2 Sapperling tokens thanks to Doubling Season. He then taps 2 and Druidic Satchel, revealing a Foul Orchard and placing it onto the battlefield. At the end of Keith's turn, Sean does his card draw shenanigans once again, casting a Defiant Strike, targeting Feather, getting his card, and then Keith's turn ends. Sean draws, Keith vapes.
Oh, yoy.
Oy, oy, oy. Wee, wee.
Sean plays a Stone Quarry tapped. He then taps 6 to play Charmbreaker Devils, allowing him to return a random instant or sorcery card to his hand from his graveyard during each of his upkeeps, as well as giving Charmbreaker a +4/+0 every time he plays an instant or sorcery. Sean then taps 1 to cast Defiant Strike targeting Feather, drawing his card and giving Feather a +1/+0.
He sacks 1 treasure to cast an Assault Stroke, targeting Feather, giving it Double Strike. He then swings the flying 4/4 Double Strike Feather in the air at Sterling. Sterling takes 8 commander damage, and Sean becomes the Monarch.
During Sean's second main phase, he taps 1, sacking 2 treasures, to cast a Duergar Hedgemage. Since he controls 2 or more planes, he destroys Keith's Doubling Season. Sean then ends his turn, drawing for Monarch. Dom draws, then taps 4 to cast Bident of Thassa, allowing him to draw a card whenever a creature he controls deals combat damage to a player. Dom then goes to combat and negotiates with Sean to allow his 2/2 Drake to attack without repercussions to become the Monarch. Sean agrees, taking 2 damage, going down to 37, making Dom the Monarch. Because the Drake dealt damage to Sean, Dom gets to draw a card thanks to the Bident of Thassa. At the end of Dom's turn, Sean taps 1 to cast Defiant Strike once again, targeting Feather. In response, Dom taps 3 to flash and hold Reaktor, preventing Sean's continued card draw and creating a treasure for himself. Dom then passes his turn. Sterling draws, then plays a Mountain. Keith vaguely threatens the crew about playing creatures at this time. Sterling taps 3 to cast Koth of the Hammer. He immediately uses his -2 ability to generate a red mana for each mountain he controls. He uses 4 of that red mana to cast Mindclaw Shaman, getting to look at an opponent's hand and casting any instant or sorcery without paying its mana cost. He debates between Sean and Dom's hands, ultimately choosing Sean's. In response, Sean casts Defiant Strike and Apostle's Blessing, targeting Feather, preventing Sterling from playing those cards. Dom gets a treasure thanks to Hole Breacher. Sterling continues with his turn, failing to find a target. Sterling uses 3 of his floating red mana and tapping 1 additional to cast Kiki-Jiki, Mirror Breaker. He then immediately taps Kiki to create a token copy of Beetleback Chief. This creates 2 goblin tokens. He then taps Krenko to create a goblin for each goblin he currently controls, creating 6 more goblins. Sterling then goes to combat and swings his 3/3 Beast and his 2/2 token Beetleback Chief at Sean. Sean blocks the 3/3 Beast with Charmbreaker, killing it, and takes the 2 from Beetleback, going down to 35. Sterling then passes his turn. Keith draws, plays a Swamp, and taps 5 for a Dictate of Erebos. In response, Dom taps 2 to counter Keith's Dictate with Counterspell. Keith then taps 4 to cast Tendershoot Dryad. Keith passes the turn. Sean draws. At the beginning of Sean's turn, he returns Wear and Tear back to his hand, thanks to his Duergar Hedgemage, and plays a Reliquary Tower as his land for turn. He then taps 5 to cast a Mirrorwing Dragon. Fuck. Sean then taps 1 to cast an Assault Strobe, targeting the Mirrorwing Dragon, which copies that spell for each other creature he controls. Sean goes to combat and swings at Sterling with a 3/4 Feather, and Dom with a currently 8/4 Charmbreaker. Sterling cannot block the flyer, and Dom attempts to block with his 9/9 Diamond Knight. In response, Sean sacrifices 2 treasures to cast Apostle's Blessing, targeting Mirrorwing Dragon, creating a copy for each other creature. He chooses to give protection from Colorless, forgetting that Colorless is actually not a color. To remedy that, he sacrifices another 2 treasures to cast Wear, targeting the Diamond Knight as an artifact, destroying it. He then taps 1 to cast Defiant Strike, targeting Mirrorwing Dragon, giving all of his creatures an additional +1/+0. He then taps his last mana and sacrifices another treasure to cast Adamant Will, once again targeting the Mirrorwing, and giving all of his creatures an additional +2/+2 and indestructible until the end of the turn. Dom is hit with a 27-6 double strike Charmbreaker Devil, and saltily scoops, dying first once again. Sterling is hit with a 6-6 double strike Feather, dealing 12 more commander damage for a total of 20, hanging on by a thread, going down to 20 total life. Sean becomes the Monarch, draws, and passes his turn. Sterling draws. Sterling taps Kiki to create a token copy of Beetleback Chief, creating 2 more Goblin tokens. He then taps Krenko to create 14 additional Goblins. He then taps 5 and uses Koth's +1 ability to untap a land, and taps it again to pay 6 for Chancellor of the Forge. When Chancellor of the Forge enters the battlefield, he creates 30 Goblins with haste, 1 for each creature he currently controls. Sean begins to slowly clench his butt. To demonstrate said fear, he begins to sing a song.
30 hasty goblins, ooh.
Alright, and then
hasty goblins.
Sterling then goes to combat and swings at Sean with 38 1/1 hasty goblins, his 2/2 token Beetleback, his original 2/2 Beetleback Chief, and a 2/2 Mindclaw Shaman. In response, Sean burns 1 treasure to cast Defiant Strike, targeting Mirrorwing Dragon and drawing 4 cards. He finds no answers. He then sacks 2 more treasures to cast Adamant Will, targeting Mirrorwing, giving his creatures indestructible. Sean blocks the original Beetleback and the Mindclaw Shaman, killing both. However, Sean succumbs to the onslaught of vicious goblins and is killed. Sterling captures the Mindclaw Shaman inside the Mimic Vat as it dies. Sterling then taps 2 to clamp 2 of his goblins, drawing 4 cards. Sterling then taps 3 to cast the Mindclaw Shaman from the Mimic Vat, forcing Keith to reveal his hand. Sterling casts a Saproling Symbiosis, creating a whole bunch of Saproling tokens. Sterling then passes his turn, drawing for Monarch. Keith faces certain death if he cannot find some way to kill Sterling this turn. Keith taps 4 to play Life and Limb, making all of his Saprolings forest lands in addition to being a Saproling, and all of his forests into 1/1 Saprolings in addition to being lands. Henceforth they shall be known as Saproforests. He then taps 3 to cast Slimefoot, the Stowaway. Keith taps 4 Saproforests to cast Parallel Lives. Sterling boasts about the size of his goblin army. Keith taps 3 to cast Ashnod's Altar. He then removes 3 spore counters from Vitaspore to create 2 Saproling tokens. Keith then sacrifices 2 Saproforests to the altar, dealing 2 damage to Sterling and gaining Keith 2 life. Sterling goes to 18 and Keith to 41. Keith also gets 4 floating mana. Keith uses 3 of his 4 floating mana to cast a morph card. Keith sacrifices another Saproforest to the altar, bringing Sterling down to 17 and Keith up to 42, creating an additional mana. Keith sacrifices another 2 Saproforests, creating 2 more mana and dealing 2 damage to Sterling, taking him down to 15 and bringing Keith to 44. Keith then burns 3 of his floating mana, taps 1 Saproforest, and mistakenly taps a newly created Saproling to flip up his morph card and reveal Thelanite Hermit, creating 8 more Saproling tokens. Keith then sacrifices 15 Saproforests to deal 15 damage to Sterling, killing him and winning the game. A great way to support our salty gameplay is by building your next deck using our TCG Player affiliate link provided in the description below.